Howdy and welcome to Bamberger Ranch. My name is Aldo Leopold. I'm the director of the Texas A&M Natural Resources Institute, and we're going to continue our Leopold Live series here at Bamberger, continuing to talk about the 5 basic tools introduced by Aldo Leopold, the father of wildlife management. These 5 tools include cow, axe, plow, fire, and gun. And what we hope to do in the upcoming months is show you how those tools can be applied, but with very specific projects and objectives. And so with me is Dr. April Sampson. She's the executive director of Bamberger, and she's going to tell us a little bit about Bamberger and what we hope to cover in the series.
Great. Thank you so much, Roel. We're really excited to have you and your colleagues from the Natural Resources Institute back here at Selah Bamberger Ranch Preserve. And we're excited about continuing our journey into Leopold Live version 2. Like Roel said, we'll be providing more detail and more useful information regarding the 5 tools that Aldo Leopold championed. Here at Selah Bamberger Ranch Preserve, we're a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and our mission is landowner stewardship, outreach, and environmental education. So we have many Central Texas school children that come visit us every year for hands-on science-based environmental education lessons, and we also lead showcase tours and workshops for landowners interested in practicing restoration and good land stewardship. So we're very happy to be partnering with Natural Resources Institute, and we know that you'll benefit a lot from the information that we are going to be talking about during this new version of Leopold Live.
So let's go ahead and get started.
Great. Welcome back to Bamberger Ranch Preserve. I am April Sansom, and I am here with Kari Hines, who's the Firewise coordinator for the Texas A&M Forest Service. And I'm really excited to have Kari out here at Selah Bamberger Ranch Preserve. I had the good fortune of meeting Kari at an event where we were both speakers. And so it's really nice that now after that event, we're getting to coordinate on some different projects. And she's out here today to help us with our current episode of Leopold Live. So just to kind of get us started off, we at Bamberger Ranch Preserve do use prescribed fire as a tool. And Kari and I are standing in an area that we burned just about a month ago. And I am actually going to hand it over to Kari now because she can talk to us a lot more about her work with the Texas A&M Forest Service and her knowledge of fire and the use of fire and all things fire. So thank you for being here with us today, Kari.
All things fire. That's a big ask for the next however long you're speaking. Thanks for having me, April. I'm really excited to be here. It's my first time at Bamberger Ranch. I'm thrilled to be able to see what you guys are doing out here. As you mentioned, my title is Firewise Coordinator. My day-to-day job is working with the residents to learn how they can protect their homes and communities from wildfire. It's my in and out, but certainly a passion of mine is prescribed fire. I love what it does on the landscape. I love being a part of it, and I love getting to come out and talk to people about it. So thanks for having me. As you said, we are in an area that was burned just about a month ago, a prescribed fire. These are coastal fields, so this is, as you mentioned, leftover from the ranching heritage of the Selah Bamberger Ranch. And the goal for this particular piece of property is trying to get it back into a more natural grass ecosystem. Obviously the coastal loved the prescribed fire, and we are in the middle of the efforts that you guys have converting it back to that natural ecosystem. And I bring up that goal very early because I think it's important to mention here within the first few minutes of this conversation is that prescribed fire is always done with a purpose, with an end goal in mind. If you are not working towards some sort of end goal, and if you don't have measurable outcomes that you can track, that is not a prescribed fire. So here with the native grass restoration in mind, doing probably multiple years of prescribed fire, and then the reseeding efforts as well.
That's right.
Depending on where you are in the state, it might also mean some herbicide application. Do you guys use herbicide out here?
We do use herbicides as a last resort. It is one of the tools in our land management toolbox. So the answer is yes. We try to use other tools first.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That makes a ton of sense. So what we do notice when we're standing out here, I already mentioned it, the coastal has loved this prescribed fire, and that is not a surprising response. One of the very early benefits of a prescribed fire is a return of nutrients to the soil, and it opens up the seed bed. So instead of having a very thick thatch layer, which we can actually see, we're standing on one right here, we have multiple inches of old grasses that have formed a thick cover, and that covers up your bare mineral soil. And when that happens, especially native seeds that are blowing in from other areas can't germinate. And so a prescribed fire is certainly an effective way of opening up that seed bed, returning nutrients to the soil, and then when you buffer it with putting native seed back down after your prescribed fire, that's where the conversion can start to happen.
We talk about thatch layers a lot with visitors to Bamberger Ranch Preserve and show them exactly what it can do. So it's nice to hear you sort of reiterating that point that we make.
Yeah. One of the things that I think a lot of people are fairly concerned about, and rightly so, when it comes to prescribed fire is, what if it gets out? Right? We have lots of tools in our toolbox when it comes to land management. When you look at the plow, the cow, the bison, the gun, and fire, right? Our toolbox of land management, and fire is one of them. We know historically, especially when we're learning from our traditional ecological knowledge providers, that fire was, of course, both natural from prescribed or from lightning and applied by the original occupants of this land. We are in Central Texas, but pretty much no matter where you are in Texas and really across the country and Northern America in general, we know that Native Americans used fire to manage their landscapes. And because of that, the ecosystems have evolved for thousands of years with fire as part of that management tool. And it's why you now see species that are more adapted to fire, species that will naturally drop their lower limbs, species that have thicker bark, or who do better under open canopy situations, right? So we know that fire is natural and normal, but that doesn't mean that it's not scary.
Right.
And especially at Texas A&M Forest Service, we highly encourage anybody who's considering doing prescribed fire on their property to take a burn manager course. We offer some through our own agency and our fuels management program. You can also look into the training provided through the Texas Department of Agriculture. Texas A&M AgriLife has programs, right? So some sort of training that teaches you the ins and outs of doing a prescribed fire, and that you'll learn all about creation of fire lines and any prep work that you may have to do, and the monitoring that follows that up. What is going to happen to your smoke? What is the weather doing? These are all things that encompass a burn manager class, which you guys have a burn manager on staff, right?
Yes, that's correct. Yep.
Yeah. So making sure whoever's doing that is qualified to do so.
So Kari, wonderful. I hear you saying a lot about how people can become educated about prescribed fire and become prepared for what to expect and really learn, which I think is really good, right? And so talk to us a little bit more about the additional steps for preparation and maybe coordinating with a prescribed burn association.
Yeah, so besides the actual courses that you can take through the various agencies to learn more about prescribed fire and potentially become a burn manager, you do have regional associations of residents who are working together to learn more about the safe and effective use of prescribed fire. those associations are generally called prescribed burn associations, or PBAs, and these are groups of people who will do a lot of education, a lot of field trips with each other, potentially assist each other when it comes to the prep work of doing prescribed fire. So very beneficial resources for landowners to learn more about fire.
That's great. That's great. So I think one of our themes today will be the fact that fire is useful. As you said before, it can be scary, but minimizing that is making sure you have a plan and making sure that you know what you're doing, correct?
Those are certainly the good starting points. Making sure you have all the tools available and you've done the necessary prep work. I mentioned it earlier. A lot of our ecosystems are so far away from what would be considered historically accurate that doing prescribed fire as a first entry tool for land management is simply not possible. There's generally other sorts of work that has to happen first, whether that is individual tree removal, whether it's mulching, whether it's herbicide, and then getting it into a prescribed fire rotation for ongoing management. Usually prescribed fire is not a one and done because things grow back. And making sure you're thinking about the longevity of your project. One of the ways to make projects longer lasting and hopefully easier when you return is the creation of your fire break. In a grass unit, we can do a prescribed fire when the surrounding vegetation does not have a possibility of being consumed. We have things like live fuel moisture and periods of dormancy or non-dormancy that we know, like right behind us here, if a fire went from this grass field and started encroaching into the woodlands, it would not be able to continue by itself because of the soil moisture and live fuel moisture and lots of other things. It would naturally put itself out as it got into the shade. If you're looking at doing prescribed fire in a more shrubby or wooded environment, again, looking at what we call predictive services. So things like, what is the weather going to do? What is my long-term moisture levels? What is the moisture content in the plants? What is the weather going to do tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that? And that lets you start looking at when we're going to have the prescribed fire. But then it'll also tell you about how tall your flame lengths are going to be. Okay?
Interesting.
And so all of these things, take a class if you want to learn more, will tell you what do I expect my fire to do, will be the basic way of saying that. And that'll tell you, do I need a 1 foot line? Do I need a 3 foot line? Do I need a 5 foot line of separation between what I plan to burn and what I do not want to burn? And often with the creation of those containment lines, you need to be thinking about things like soil erosion and where your water is going to be flowing. Because if we're going through and we're creating basically mini trails or roads, are we creating water bars? Are we doing wing ditches? Are we putting in mats to make, whatever your soil erosion control is potentially going to be?
Sure, that's great. And I think that's so important to think about all the things that go into a well-created and well-executed management plan, of which fire is an important part, right?
Sure. Yeah.
We talked about how this coastal really is pretty happy about this right now. What about native grasses? Talk to us a little bit about that and how they would respond to being burned like this.
Sure. Native grasses, vegetation in general, even wildlife. I'm going to use a very science-y answer, and I'm going to say it depends.
We love that answer, don't we?
On so many factors, but in general, because wildfire is a natural part of our ecosystem, in general, most native wildlife and plant species will benefit from the use of prescribed fire. Whether that means you're opening up pockets of your soil for native seed regeneration, whether that's shrubs, forbs, or trees. For wildlife, and whether or not that wildlife species is going to benefit from the use of prescribed fire, again, it depends. You have to have your target species in mind, whether you're looking at quail or turkey, or whether you're looking at red-cockaded woodpecker or songbirds, or whether it's ungulates like your deer species, right? So depending on what species you are trying to create better habitat for, you're going to use prescribed fire differently. It can influence, of course, the cover feature, right? So the things that wildlife need to survive, you need cover, you need forage and water, right? Space. So those are generally the things. I'm not a wildlife ecologist, but I think I remember that from class. So obviously the forage and the cover can be greatly impacted by the use of prescribed fire, and how hot we burn that fire, or what time of year we're going to burn, can all influence the outcomes, which I think is one of the really fun things of prescribed fire. The Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center in Austin.
A great place.
Great place, wonderful place. I've been lucky enough to participate in some of the prescribed fires that they have there. And much like yours, much smaller scale than, say, some of the couple 100-acre prescribed fires that I've been on with, than some of the prescribed fires that I've been on with Travis Parks or Texas Parks and Wildlife.
Sure.
But because of that, they can kind of play around with how they burn those very small units. We're talking only sometimes a couple of acres at a time. And they have found in some of their research plots, I love this, and other people know more, go visit the Austin Wildflower Center. Depending on the time of year they do the burns, different wildflowers come up in the spring.
Wow.
Nothing different than the time, like whether it's a spring
That's
burn or a fall
amazing.
burn, which, yeah, we could geek out about that all day long.
Absolutely, we could.
Yeah, so the answer, not facetiously saying, is it depends, because the target species that you are either trying to decrease in population, or you're trying to create a more hospitable habitat for, you will do different things with your prescribed fire, and with your prep work, and with your post work.
Sure, it makes sense, right?
I think a fairly large misconception sometimes from general public who I encounter is that when we do a prescribed fire, we're just lighting matches in the woods.
Right.
And we're going around and we're just lighting things. And the amount of prep work and planning that has to go into one of these prescribed fires, not just for the safety of the people doing the prescribed fire, but for the long-term health of the ecosystem,
right,
is just an immense amount of work.
I'm sure that's true, and I'm sure that just as many folks may not realize that fire is such an integral part of these natural ecosystems, like we're trying to encourage here at Bamberger Ranch Preserve. I would imagine it's very common that people don't, if they haven't had the experience, they don't quite understand how much planning goes into one of these things. Yes.
Yeah. It starts months in advance generally, if not, well, months in advance just for the day of the burn, years in advance potentially for actually getting the unit ready, that piece of land ready for a prescribed fire. If we look at some of the long-term impacts from wildfire, again, it depends.
Right.
But you have your first effect, or your first order effects. So those are things that are going to come days within weeks of that initial prescribed fire. And then you have your longer term effects that are going to be things that you really don't see the impact of for potentially months or years at a time. Obviously, our first order effects on this one was the immediate release of nutrients into the soil. We have an opening up of the soil bed that we've already talked about, and now you have a response. And this is not unique to coastal. You asked earlier, what about our native grasses? And I don't think I ever actually answered you. But yes, native grasses love wildfire for the same wildfire, sorry, and prescribed fire.
Right.
I'm more used to talking about wildfire.
Sure.
For that opening of the seedbed and the release of nutrients. And not only do the grasses love it, but because of that, your grass eaters love it. So anything that forages on small bushes and grasses we generally see an almost immediate attraction to an area after a prescribed fire from those herbivores, which is one of the reasons that Native Americans used fire in those hunter-gatherer communities, was to attract wildlife to them. And
it makes sense.
To go and find them.
Right.
So, other things that prescribed fires do that are good, besides, you know, the immediate recreation of a very nutrient-rich forage for the herbivores. Oh gosh, there's so many things. There, you have a negative response in the amount of pests that you have in your ecosystem. So things like fleas and ticks, those populations will decline. And that's not just by us telling stories. There's actually research that's occurring at a national level looking at populations of ticks post-prescribed fire.
That's fascinating. You wouldn't immediately think about it, but it makes a lot of sense. That's really interesting.
Yep, especially on the eastern coast of the United States, where there's a lot of the negative, a lot of the diseases that are associated with ticks, where there's very high populations. A lot of research going into that. A lot of people are very concerned about wildlife post-prescribed fire, especially the larger prescribed fires. And while that's valid, most animals have a way of getting away from prescribed fire. And in general, our prescribed fires move fairly slow. I'm not saying they're always creeping along the forest floor, but they do generally move slow enough that an animal would be able to either burrow away, fly away, or run away. Of course, there are examples of individual mortality during prescribed fire, but again, another very well-researched topic is the amount of ecosystem benefits received from that prescribed fire, and how then it creates a more hospitable landscape for larger populations.
Right.
Specifically looking at turkey populations in East Texas, there's been a lot of research done with concern to whether burning over individual nests during late winter, early spring prescribed fires, if you're doing enough damage to the nests that it puts a hurt in the population. But the population booms that occur after the prescribed fire happen have been found to certainly make up for potential for individual loss.
Right, fascinating. That's great. So Kari, you mentioned working and collaborating with several different agencies on fire programs. Can you talk a little bit about that kind of collaboration and what level of collaboration that requires?
Yeah. Well, you brought me out here today to talk about the benefits of prescribed fire, right? That was your teaser hook, and I love talking about it. And I think this falls under it. It may not be something that you initially think about as a benefit of prescribed fire, because we think about ecological benefits.
Sure.
But the ability for agencies to work together, it is absolutely, maybe not absolutely impossible, but fairly dang impossible for a single land management agency to be able to complete a prescribed fire by themselves.
Right.
Whether it's because they don't have that burn manager on staff, whether it's they don't have enough manpower on staff, right? We were just talking, you guys have a handful of people out here.
Absolutely.
And if you're trying to complete a prescribed burn that's anywhere from a dozen acres to 100 to 200 acres, you need a decent amount of people to complete that. So organizations like Texas Parks and Wildlife, Travis County Parks, Austin Water, even some of our federal partners, U.S. Forest Service in East Texas, U.S. Fish and Wildlife along the Gulf Coast, and there in Travis County with the Ranch Preserve, will often invite other organizations to bring people and equipment to assist on their prescribed fires. And not only is that just something that we enjoy doing, but it's incredibly beneficial because we get to go out and practice our skills, use our equipment, see fire in the landscape, which at least for us at Texas A&M Forest Service feeds right back into being able to safely and effectively respond to wildfire.
Right.
It also creates relationships with our surrounding agencies when we get to help each other out that then lead to other programs and future relationships. There are people that I know because I met them on a prescribed fire that I would have never met otherwise. And we have since done things like this.
Right.
I go and I speak for a class, or I use their classroom space at Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, and it's because I know the people at that facility.
Sure.
So it's a major benefit. It also allows us to work on our qualifications. In the world of public government, the work that we have to do, both in the classes that we take and how we prove ourselves capable of operating during a fire, are how we progress through those qualifications.
Right.
So without being able to go out on prescribed fire or a wildfire, you're literally capped with how far you can progress.
Right.
If that's what you want to do. So the benefits of relationship building and your own personal professional development is one of the non-ecological benefits of prescribed fire.
That's wonderful, and that's a huge benefit, especially since learning from other professionals and continuing those professional development activities is so important. Really anywhere, but particularly when part of your job is making sure that you, as you mentioned, are protecting people and property from wildfire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's harken back to what I said about 15 minutes ago.
Yes.
With my full-time job with the agency being public outreach. My full-time job is not land management.
Right.
As much as I love it, and that's where my background is, the relationships that I have created have allowed me to much more effectively reach the public. I can call up a peer at another organization and say, hey, we're doing something in your neighborhood. Can you assist, or do you want to send people? Or so my full-time job being teaching people how to protect their homes and their communities from wildfire. The national program is Firewise USA. That's what my title harkens to. But there are a lot of fundamental things people can do on their own properties, whether you have a quarter of an acre or 10 acres, it doesn't matter. When we're looking at protecting homes from wildfire, we know that there are some very set steps that most everyone can take. I'm not saying it's accessible for everyone, but most everyone can take some simple steps that protects their homes against wildfire. And a lot of it actually goes back to our understanding of how fire moves through the landscape.
Right.
And how do we learn that? By going on
Exactly.
So when we're looking at protecting specifically homes and the built environment that humans have created from wildfire in particular, a lot of it is trying to slow down a fire the closer it gets to our homes and communities, right? We want it as low to the ground as possible and moving as slow as possible as it approaches our homes. And we know how to do that, which I think there's a lot of natural disasters out there that it's going to happen or it's not going to happen, and there's not much we can do about it. When you look at hurricanes and tornadoes and earthquakes, certainly we can build our structures in a certain way. We can build them in certain places, but if that tornado is going to pass over your house, it's going to pass over your house.
Right.
With wildfire, wildfire only moves when it's called the elements of combustion exist. And if you can break a stepping stone in that progression, or a ladder in that, a rung in the ladder, then you can absolutely make the difference as to whether or not your home survives a wildfire. And that's what I do.
That's great. And so talk more about your sort of daily routine, because that is your task with the Texas A&M Forest Service. So talk to us about what that looks like, a day in the life of Kari.
Sitting either in front of a computer or behind a steering wheel, generally. It's a lot of relationship building. It's a lot of coordination between partners trying to reach our audiences. I am under no misconception that preparing for wildfires is not at the top of most people's list, right? Of their, like, I'm going to wake up today, I'm going to take my kid to school, I'm going to go to the doctor's office, and I'm going to prepare for a wildfire. Like, that's not generally on people's to-do list. So a lot of what I do and the department that I work for and my peers do are trying to find ways to make this sort of work more accessible, whether that's financially or physically, or even intellectually, and even knowing what it is that you need to do to do some of this work.
Right.
But it's also pairing it with the things that the other things that people care about. So if you're very concerned about wildlife habitat and you think I'm going to come in and tell you to get rid of all your native species because I'm going to fireproof your yard, which by the way is impossible, you can't fireproof a yard.
Right.
But let's talk about how we can both create that pollinator garden or the songbird habitat and pair that with wildfire preparedness. Maybe it's community safety. We have a lot of people who are especially emotionally attached to your first responders, right? Creating a safe environment for our police officers and our firefighters to work in. Well, let's talk about how creating a community that's more prepared for wildfire, that means less law enforcement officers that are having to go door to door during a wildfire trying to get people to evacuate.
Right.
So there's all these things that we can do to combine what people already care about with the sort of work that we do. We said it earlier, fire is a completely normal and natural part of our ecosystem. We're not going to get rid of it.
Right.
And it should be here.
Right.
We are the ones that inserted ourselves into these ecosystems, and we're going to have to live with it. But there are absolutely things that we can do to help balance that. And sometimes it's certainly drought. Are you impacted by drought out here at the Selah Bamberger Ranch? Are we impacted by drought in Texas? So if you look at drought resiliency,
right.
Being able to have a landscape that won't be as impacted by short or long-term periods of drought.
Right.
Can be paired with wildfire preparedness, pests and diseases. So if you're looking at things like bark beetles, where I am in Central Texas, we have pine trees.
Right.
Or if you're in East Texas, you have pine trees. You have bark beetles that, of course, go after juniper and eastern red cedar. So a tree is more likely to be able to withstand bark beetles if it is just generally a healthier tree in a healthy landscape.
Right.
Guess what? That also makes a wildfire resilient landscape,
Exactly.
right? So a lot of the job is pairing it together with other things people care about.
Sure, I think that's wonderful. It sounds very rewarding to pair those kinds of things together and help people match up what they care about with what they can plan.
Yeah, there's occasionally, I'm sure you've experienced it as well, you guys bring groups out here and somebody will have that little light bulb moment like, oh, this makes sense. I can do this. This is something I can accomplish. I can create a pollinator habitat in the city on my quarter-acre yard,
Exactly.
and it makes a difference.
Absolutely, and we say that a lot. You're absolutely right. We talk about that a lot, that whether it's 50,000 acres or 5,000 or a fifth of an acre, you can do something that makes a positive difference, for sure. Hi again. We've changed our position to a little more of an edge habitat. And it's really important to think about how one of the main themes of Bamberger Ranch Preserve is woody encroachment of a species that we know and love, which is ash juniper. But it's an important part of our story, and obviously fire is an important part of that relationship. And it reminds me of an episode of Leopold Live that we did a little while ago, where we focus specifically on ash juniper and ash juniper management. And so now we have the opportunity to talk a little bit more with Kari about woody encroachment in general. So this is a wonderful spot to do that in, isn't it, Kari?
Absolutely. As we've already discussed, there is absolutely a role to play for multiple species, and it depends, right? It depends where you are in the landscape, your end goals for the property, how historically accurate you're trying to get back to your ecosystem type. And we know one of the ecosystem types that's most vulnerable with the absence of wildfire or historically set fire is our open meadows, our grasslands, our prairies. These areas, if succession is allowed to take place, will move on from an open meadow, from an open prairie, grassland, whatever, and they will be invaded, we call it, with our woody species. We know that historically fire would have ripped through those grassy areas and it would have kept the meadow open and the edge of the forest back. And of course, there's a mosaic to it. There's no hard and fast lines,
Right.
but there are areas of grassland, there's areas of patchy, there's areas of dense, and it completely depends on where you are. We're here at the opening of this little slot canyon that's coming down from behind us, and we have a couple species here that are completely traditional for this ecosystem type. So we have pecan over here off to my left. We have a small buckeye seedling here. Right underneath it we have some hackberry growing up, and we have some over there, and then of course behind us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 junipers, and then one in front here of ash juniper persimmon. So very traditional, native, beneficial, ecologically important species. What can happen over time is the forest edge starts moving out, especially with the native species that are dropped, that are seed spread, right? So your hackberries and your junipers in particular, your Hercules clubs, you will find those along fence lines and underneath power lines because that's where birds deposit them. And it's one of the many uses of prescribed fire, especially as you guys are using it here in your grassland ecosystems, is to keep that woody encroachment out and try to maintain that grassy ecosystem type.
Right. And that's a common theme throughout grasslands across the world. Isn't that correct, Kari?
Oh, absolutely. You have, especially north of where we are, when you get into the tall, historically what would have been tall grass prairies, where you're looking at grasses natively that would have been 5, 6 feet tall. We have very small percentages of those native ecosystems left across the United States and of course across the globe, where humans have disrupted the natural disturbance cycle.
Right, absolutely. So it's a common story. And I appreciate you pointing out, I think it's really important to point out that right here in the hill country, the native condition would have been a mosaic of different types of those habitats that we've been talking about. Isn't that correct?
Oh, absolutely. And it's one of the things I first remember from, I think, my Forestry 101 class, day one, is what is forestry, what is ecology, what, all these definitions, and it's the art and science of, right? There's the science behind it, of course, but there's a little bit of art that goes along with it.
That's well said. Well, thank you for what you do, Kari.
No, I appreciate you having me out here today, April.
Well, thanks for coming, and you're welcome at any time.